Hey Dave, how you doing today?
Not bad, Nick. How are you?
Fantastic.
Always. You're always doing
Beautiful,
fantastic.
stormy day here in April. April showers are a real thing this year, apparently.
That's right. That's right.
But it's
And
warm out, so
yeah,
I'm not complaining at all.
unseasonably warm. And we'll see if we make it through this without an internet interruption on the account of the lightning I'm hearing or thunder I'm hearing in the background.
That's right. So, today's episode, Dave, we've got kind of an interesting little case study, if you will, on a couple of MSU professors. And we're just going to kind of take a look at some of the common scenarios that come up in a
Yeah.
case like this when we're helping people kind of create their financial plan and talk through some different scenarios and how to think about them.
Yeah. It's kind of a composite of some folks that we've met with over the last couple of years. And just to kind of help people get a general feel for how we look at things and how we string a plan together.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to look at it because a lot of these questions, a lot of these things that come up quite often. And so, like we say, there's no firm answers of exactly what you should do in these scenarios, but there's certainly some ways to think about these things that will hopefully help guide our listeners if they have similar questions in their own personal scenarios. So,
Yeah.
with
So
that build up, Dave, what are we talk? What are we? Give us a scenario.
So the scenario is we're working with two married professors from Michigan State University,
Mm-hmm.
and we've got Dr. John Doe, who is 45 years old, and Dr. Jane Doe, who is 43 years old, and they've got two kids: Jimmy, who's in high school, age 15, and Susie, who's 12.
Love it.
So they've come to us with some pretty typical concerns for what we hear from people when they're first coming in for financial planning. With, the first thing being, they know they should be balancing college savings and retirement savings, but they don't
Mm-hmm.
have they don't feel like they're doing a good job of either one. Like they have just no idea if what they're doing from their paycheck into the retirement plan and savings for college is enough or too much, or how to scale that.
Yeah, that's a common one, not just college, but just kind of in general around the lines of like, how do you find out if you're on track, right? Like, there's so much information out there on the internet right now. You can easily
Mm-hmm.
dive down a rabbit hole and get 78 different answers. And so a lot of times I think what happens because there's so much information out there, we just kind of look next door and maybe see what our neighbors are doing or.
Right. Yeah.
And that's not always the best approach. But
Yeah.
frankly, it's usually the worst approach.
Yeah. Right. The whole benchmark idea.
Mm-hmm.
How am I doing compared to my neighbor has very little relevance to how you're actually doing in retirement planning.
Right. Yeah, for
So,
sure.
so some other concerns to kind of go with those. John would like to work until a normal retirement age, which usually means mid 60s.
Mm-hmm.
But Jane would like to have a little more flexibility sooner and younger, just based on how she feels about her job and what she's done so far. But they worry about whether that's even feasible. Do they both have to work till they're 65? Do they both have to work till they're 70? Is it feasible for one of them to step back earlier? How would that look?
Yeah. Another interesting one that comes up a lot just from the standpoint of I think a lot of people feel like they have to retire together. And that's,
Yeah. Now
not
our
always the best scenario or the best case and not always true.
Right, right. It's often better for one spouse to retire first and get settled, and then the other, not for financial reasons so much as psychological reasons.
Yeah, for sure.
And our old partner and mentor, Beth, I remember hearing her forbid people to retire at the same time with people she knew well. Like, no, no, you're going to let John retire for 6 months and then it'll be your turn, but let's figure that out first. But anyway,
That sounds like Beth.
yeah, right, right. And and they would also, their goal is to pay for an in-state education for each of their children if they can. That would be their
Mm-hmm.
goal.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's pretty common when we're working with college faculty that education is kind of a priority in a way it really isn't. It's a stronger priority, a stronger preference than it sometimes is with other folks.
For sure. And the other thing that I'll add to the whole college education piece for MSU faculty and staff, for that
Mm-hmm.
matter, is there's a hometown discount. And
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't always play out well in the dynamics of you want your kid to go off and, experience things on their own, but also it's way cheaper for them to go to Michigan State. And so figuring out and having that discussion and dynamic and how to plan for, both of those, because I feel like a lot of people, their kids end up not going to Michigan State, even though there is a discount involved.
Right, right. And, in this scenario, they own their own home in East Lansing and they refinanced it a few years ago. So it's important to John that they be out of debt before they retire.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a common thing we hear from people too.
Yep, for sure.
There's also, concerns over insurance coverage with young kids at home. And just in general, John and Jane feel like they should have more money. They should have more savings. They get paid well, but there never seems to be any money in the savings account at the end of the month.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, and as we kind of go through this case, but I feel like a lot of people, even people who are good savers, kind of feel like they don't have as much money as maybe they should.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just the lack of confidence a little bit, but also of like knowing where you stand, right?
Right.
Knowing like
Right.
how close you are, or are you on track or not for your goals, can go a long way once you figure that out to your confidence of what you kind of have in terms of cash flow, right?
Exactly. So just a couple of facts for background that we made up to help drive our thought process here as we're helping John and Jane. They're each putting the mandatory 5% into their MSU retirement plan right now, which means they also get a 10% match from the university.
Mm-hmm.
They're also doing $200 per month each for Jimmy and Susie into 529 plan accounts
Mm-hmm.
for college. And their mortgage was created in 2020. They refinanced in 2020 and got that one of those really good rates we were seeing in 2020. They're at 3% for a 30-year mortgage
Mm-hmm.
with a $300,000 balance, which comes out to a payment of just under $1,250 a month. But right now, John, to meet that goal of his of paying off the mortgage before retirement, is actually paying $2,500 a month.
All right. So
how do we tackle this?
yeah, those are the facts. So our approach then, and I love that you put this first in our little layout here, because that's exactly how we would tackle it. And that is, we've got all these facts, we've got all these concerns, but
Mm-hmm.
what matters more than anything is figuring out and working through your life plan, figuring out what's most important to you. What do you value most? What do you want to get out of the short amount of time you have on this earth? Once we figure that out, then we can kind of start to figure out how do we put the pieces together, right?
Yeah.
So we can have that conversation about retirement target dates and priorities, right? We can have that conversation
Mm-hmm.
around what you want to provide for the kids, because that's not always equal in terms of the college goal, right? Like, how much do you want to provide? How much do you want them to provide? And what are there restraints on that, right? Are we talking any college in the US or even internationally? Are we talking local in state? And have you had that conversation with your kids of what that looks like?
And those answers can be all over the place. I've had Michigan State faculty clients who had a child that had no interest in going to MSU, really wanted to go to a small private school out of state. And for her parents, that was worth it. And they were willing to take on some debt themselves to make it happen. Whereas I've had others that have said, I'm willing to pay what I would pay if they went to Michigan State,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll need to fund the rest.
Yeah.
And I've seen answers all in the middle too.
Yeah, and that part of what I love about our job is that it's always different. And then,
Oh yeah,
but you want to relate that to what your values are, right? Like if
right,
education is important to you and it's your number one priority to provide your kids education wherever they want to go, that's great. But that's
right.
not going to be everybody's, right? And so having that conversation with all the involved parties and figuring that out goes a long way to make sure that what you're doing on the front end matches what's most important to you, right? Um, so I think that's a huge step in trying to figure that out, is figuring out what your values are and what's most important to you, and then backing into it from there. And
Yeah,
we do that through, our life planning process of really kind of distilling things down, figuring out all the things out there that are important to you, and then prioritizing them from a step-by-step basis to say, hey, our number one priority is this, number two,
mm-hmm.
number three, and then from the financial side, we can kind of work things in, right? And I have
Right,
yet to do this, Dave, where somebody said my number one goal is to build as much wealth as possible, right?
right.
Which
That
is
usually,
unfortunate because that's an easy answer.
yeah. Well, they might say that at the beginning of the process, but they're not going to say it by the end.
That's right. That's right.
So, um, yeah, yeah. And so then, once we've kind of worked through the broad strokes goal setting, then it's a matter of us in the background, then, putting all of this information into our meat grinder, um, financial planning software, and then we can work through scenarios and actually show the trade-offs with money and how to match those up to those goals and values.
Yeah, absolutely. So we usually will run a Monte Carlo projection to make sure that we're on pace as far as what we're saving for retirement and education, and then look through and see what kind of gaps we have. It will help us analyze, do we need more for education, less for retirement? How does that all play into it? What are the taxes of that? So there's a lot that kind of goes into those discussions, and what we want to see as kind of the outcomes. Um, but it's a great way to kind of start to look at moving the pieces around a little bit, right? Like, here's what it looks like if you save more for college versus retirement, or put more towards paying off your mortgage versus less. And so it really kind of gives us the tools to look at things in real time and look at how it changes and affects outcomes over the long term.
Right, right. And yeah, we didn't we didn't make up 403b balances for Jane and John. As you know, we don't need to get into the nuts and bolts of what we would actually recommend for them. But when we start looking at the trade-offs, maybe they need to increase. Once we've kind of figured out, yes, Jane can retire at 60 and John can work till 65, and with what we think they need to spend, that works out well. Well, then maybe they need to bump up the retirement savings 2 or 3% a
Mm-hmm.
year between now and then, and maybe to meet their college goals, we need to try to come up with another $100 a month for each child. But we can take those goals and values and kind of distill them down to, here's what you would need to do to make this work. Figure out what the obstacles are and how we get around those.
Yeah, well, and especially when we're talking about the retirement college savings trade off, right? Like, we can then go in and run, okay, if your kid wants to go to private school and you want to pay for it, here's what it looks like. But that also means that you end up having to work an extra 2 years. You can't retire at 63. You got to wait until 65. Is that trade off worth it to you, right? Like, those are the real lifetime decisions of moving stuff around that I think really help people think about what's most important to them. For some people, that trade-off might be worth it. For other people, it might not. But really seeing how those decisions affect things in the long
Mm-hmm.
term helps you get an understanding of what's more important to you and what you want to see happen.
Yeah. And then, so once we've got that all kind of baked down to a scenario that the client's comfortable with, then we try to break it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for young couples, and as we expressed at the beginning, John and Jane are worried about their insurance coverage. But for younger clients that then also have kids at home still, that insurance conversation can be a pretty important one.
Mm-hmm.
So we can look at, how they're currently covered. Most folks are going to have some coverage through work for group life. Is that enough? What can we do within the benefits that Michigan State offers to get them more coverage if needed?
Mm-hmm.
And we can also talk about the pros and cons, because you can increase your coverage through your employer, but sometimes it makes sense to look at private outside options too.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of working with MSU folks is the benefits are so strong at Michigan State that, we can check a lot of the boxes already by what's covered, and at a pretty minimal cost. But like you said, there's some things that we need to think of around: do you have enough coverage, and does it make sense to use the benefits you have available? Or are we going to need more than what they offer? Or does it make more sense to have a policy that's not tied to work? And so there's some things to think through there that's going to be different for everybody. But you're right, they're kind of in this phase where they need less insurance than what they probably did 10 years ago. It's kind of on the downswing, but they're still probably going to want some life insurance coverage going into, the kids getting to that point where they're through college, and also each other. And then, the disability policies, the personal liability policies, all important stuff to kind of make sure that you understand what the risks are, and making sure that you have secured enough coverage based on what your long-term goals are.
Right. And recognize that's going to change here over the next few years as the kids get out of high school, get out of the nest, start spending those college funds as they were intended, and get launched in life. That then the parents' insurance need really evolves as that goes on. So,
for sure. Yep.
Yeah, and I'd really want to talk to John about his goal for paying the mortgage off before retirement, especially since they've got an extremely low rate locked in, and they've got some immediate needs, right? We may need to redirect some of that extra income rather than to the mortgage. It might make sense to look at the 529 plans. If their son's going to be starting college in 3 years, then, that may have to be more of a priority in the short run, depending on how those values and goals conversations work out.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big chunk of, compared, they're paying what, about $1,200 extra a month on the mortgage.
Yeah,
and so,
basically doubling up their $1,250 required.
Yeah.
payment.
And at 3%, is that worth it long term? What does that mean? What does that look like? Another thing, and kind of as this relates to college funding, that sometimes people forget is, you don't always have to have everything saved to pay for all 4 years of college. A lot of people will cash flow some of that, where the kids, not eating, you're not filling up the pantry as much. And so you have some lower costs there, and you can, pay a certain monthly amount, or set aside a certain monthly amount that was going to food and things like that and extras, where you don't have that anymore. So you could use that for tuition. So it's not usually an all or none decision when it comes to funding college education, in terms of having it all saved versus being able to pay some of it ongoing.
Yes. I think with this particular scenario, we really want to get at why it's important to the client to have the mortgage paid off. Is it just that that's what they've heard is a good practice? Or is it that they, a lot of times it's based on family history, right?
Right.
And, if you had a grandparent who in retirement really struggled with cash flow and income, and told you when you were 12 years old that you better not have any debt when you get to retirement, that's, so what, what's driving that? And then I'd also want to look at, okay, if that is really a strong goal of John's, we're talking 25 or 20 years before he actually retires, most likely, right? He's
Mm-hmm.
45 now when he comes to us, and he's looking at retirement at 65. Well, to pay that mortgage off does require, if it's a 30-year mortgage, and he did it a couple of years ago, they're going to have 7 plus or minus years left over when he hits retirement if they just make their normal payments.
Right.
But doubling up their payments may not be necessary.
Yeah.
So, we could run an amortization table, and we could actually look at, okay, what happens if for the next 5 or 6 years while the kids are getting ready to go to college and in college, map that out as, hey, maybe we're just making our normal payments on the mortgage, but then once they are no longer on the payroll, so to speak, then you turn around and hit the mortgage harder. I still would try to discuss with them the pros and cons of paying off a 3% mortgage early versus investing that money over the long run. But we've got to recognize that a lot of that is psychology, right?
Yeah.
And that paying off a 3% debt may have more appeal to the client than investing money that may make 7 or 8%.
Right.
We've
Yeah.
got to recognize that.
There's no there's no easy answer because there is a lot of psychology in there. But certainly how I would want to look at that, like you said, is what are the alternatives for that, $1,200 a month, right? If we put it into your 403B plan, are we reducing your taxes right now? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to utilize that I would want to know about and discuss as we discuss how important it is to pay off the mortgage. Because there's a lot of room to do some stuff with that extra money that potentially could put them in a much better place than where they're at and than having the mortgage paid off. So not that everybody has to, not advocating for one way or the other, right? Like we're not advocating that everybody should have a mortgage in retirement. We're not advocating that everybody should have it paid off, but you certainly should look at the different options and how that affects outcomes.
Right. Well, and just, not to put too fine a point on it, but a mortgage that was done in 2020 at 3% and a mortgage that's done in 2023 at 6.5%, those conversations can look very different.
Yeah.
So, just even if the client psychology is the same, the time frame and the what the market is doing in the meantime makes a difference too. So lots to talk about there. And the point of this scenario is just to kind of raise the issues, not necessarily, solve them all, because we'd have to write up a full psychological workup of John and Jane to,
there you go.
to really, pretend that this is a cut and dry scenario. But, then, along those lines too, one of the things we tackle along the way is figuring out their risk tolerance, how they feel about their portfolio and the markets. And, we often say there's 2 components to that, right? There's risk tolerance and there's risk capacity. So we're figuring out what their risk capacity is as we're doing the planning. How much money do they need to make on their 403B? How much money, what works to get the plan done? Do they need to be somewhat aggressive, moderate, conservative? What works for the plan? And then we try to meet in the middle based on what works in the plan and what John and Jane are comfortable with.
Yeah, so it's definitely, most people set up their 403Bs and then, a lot of them don't look at it or don't change things. And so it's a great kind of time to come together and talk about what that looks like, right? If you're are you in a target date fund? Have you selected your own funds?
Yeah.
How do we get there? And how does that match up with what your risk tolerance is and also what the plan dictates?
Right. I would say people fall into 2 camps. There's those that set it up when they're 25 and never think about it again. And then there's those who obsess about it and change things all the time. There's no happy medium. But yeah, that's definitely part of the planning process is then, figuring out what their contributions need to be, but also then how to invest those funds in the plan. Yep. And, we've got the tools to help people figure out which funds to use in TIA or Fidelity
Mm-hmm.
within the Michigan State Plan.
And then last but not least on our approach here, Dave,
Yeah,
we've gone through this one several times.
yeah, and it's part of why I saved it for last. But we also do tend to move it a little bit later in the planning process anyway,
Mm-hmm.
because usually it's drawn out over a couple months. But we need to see where your money's going. And one of the concerns John and Jane had were that they make a lot of money but never seem to have any money.
Yep.
So the only good way to figure that out is to sit down and do a budget and see where your money's going.
Yeah, such an important part of the process for several different reasons. One, obviously, is we don't, we want to figure out where the money's going and make sure that, are you just worried about money and that's why it always feels like it's gone? Or is it actually gone and we're not really tracking it close enough and there's things that we need to tighten up? And all of that also plays into what it looks like in retirement, right? Like all of the retirement projections are based on what kind of income that you're going to need. And so we need to know where you're at and how your spending is, because that number may go up or down based on what we find when we start doing cash flow and what that looks like.
Right. And it helps us also figure out how to, if there is excess, how to redeploy it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Within the other recommendations that we're making. So yeah, you can't get away from cash flow planning and budgeting.
It is the building blocks of a financial plan, right? It's always in there somewhere. It's always important. It's not glamorous, but it's always something that's got to be done.
Yep. Yeah.
So with that, after going through that approach, we should have a really good idea, and we should be able to talk through each of these issues with John and Jane to make decisions on what's best for them. And then it's a matter of, implementing a lot of that stuff. And then, Dave, as you're well aware, something's going to happen in 6 months or a year and things are going to change and we're going to readjust some of those values and goals and priorities. And
clients aren't allowed to change once we make the plan. Pretty much etched in stone.
That's right. That's my famous joke. I haven't created a financial plan that came true yet.
Right.
Something's always changing. Something's always going wonky and needing to be readjusted, sometimes for really good reasons, sometimes for not great reasons. But that's an important part, is the sooner we can identify those changes and come up with a game plan, the better off you are, the more likely you are to be successful as that stuff kind of comes in and happens. So always an important reminder that this is just the beginning of the work. It's laying the groundwork, and then everything that happens from here on out is how we adjust to that.
Absolutely. So I think we've covered everything for our made-up professors here.
Yeah. The only thing for next time is I think we have to get more creative with the names.
Yeah, I know. That's my fault.
No worries. So with that, if our listeners have questions or other topics they'd like to hear, please feel free to shoot us an email at info@srbadvisors.com. Dave, this has been a great exercise. I enjoyed it and looking forward to the next one.
Sounds good, Nick. Thank you.